Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present the findings from a piece of research that we did last year that was focusing on COVID-19 impacts as well as vaccine uptake in low-income neighborhoods. And I agree with you that there are very strong similarities with the work that we did with the work that is being done under ACRC, as I will also illustrate with some of the policy insights. Next slide. So basically the first slide is outlining the context in the documented slums, where you normally witness huge infrastructure gaps and land tenure insecurity issues and increase in urban poverty coupled with diminished resilience capacities. However, amidst all this, there's been a lot that has been happening around community-led mobilizing and organizing, mobilization of community savings and building collaborations as part of community efforts to try and deal with the pandemic. Next slide. So in terms of methodology, we used FGDs, surveys, and GIS-based mapping tools, and we were supported, or the process was led by community researchers as part of the HDI approach. And the study sites include Mbare in my Joburg area, Tafara, Boko Haram, Epworth, Heathcliff, Stone Ridge, and Hopley. These are informal settlements. They differ in terms of the nature of the settlements. Next slide. So in terms of COVID-19 impacts in slums, land tenure, what are the land tenure findings? I think what we discovered, and which is something that is connected with the ACRC research, that the epicenter of COVID impacts were cities. Perhaps largely because of the densities that you find in cities. But when you look at the cities also, you notice that informal settlements in cities were disproportionately affected by the pandemic due to many reasons, and some of which include issues to do with land tenure insecurity and service gaps in slums contributed most to this uneven impact of the pandemic, because in most of the instances, communities were unable to cope, for example, even practice hand hygiene practices, because there wasn't enough water in these communities. In many instances, people have to travel very long distance to fetch water. And yet, during the pandemic, there was high demand for water in terms of hand washing, etc. And then also, given the illegality tag that is often attached to informal settlements or slums, meant that they were typically missing from the radar of the state in terms of the COVID-19 responses that came after the pandemic. So it means that there was, in terms of focus, largely formal settlements compared to informal settlements in terms of many of the responses that were targeting communities in cities. Then demolitions and evictions were also unleashed as containment measures posed, and this posed some displaced households into space sharing arrangements, thereby increasing densities even further. So there was an argument that because informal settlements there are high densities in those spaces, they ought to be evicted residents or demolished, because they were arguing that they are potentially super spreaders. So that resulted in disruptions in terms of livelihoods and displacements. Next slide. Then what were the impacts in terms of water and sanitation? Like I indicated earlier, that during the pandemic, demand for water spiked, and yet in most of these settlements, they are either not connected to the water grid, the city's water grid, or they are using communal water points, which are normally characterized by high demand in these informal settlements. And then the increasing communal water and sanitation units alongside building awareness around good hygiene practices also proved to be quite crucial in managing the pandemic in these slum communities. Then what we also noted in one of the settlements is that informal private water suppliers thrived during the pandemic, as people had no option but also to buy water from some of the informal suppliers. And one example is a settlement called Hopley in Harare. Then there was also a lot of social issues around water and sanitation, and one of which is abuse of women and young girls at the communal water points. For example, in order for them to some girls to access water, there were some people who controlled these water points, and some were even forced in situations whereby for water you need to get into a relationship with some of these men that control these water points. So besides the water and sanitation challenges that spiked during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were also some social dimensions related to the pandemic as well. Next slide. Then in terms of socioeconomic findings, the major highlights, the securitized lockdowns that came up during the pandemic or at the height of the waves indiscriminately led to closure and demolition of informal markets, either cutting off or reducing household income streams. And a majority of households struggled to allocate expenditure for PPEs and hand hygiene essentials, given that incomes were reduced or either were cut off as a result of displacements or demolitions of informal markets. Households found it very difficult to allocate resources from the household budget towards PPEs and hand hygiene essentials. These were actually considered as luxuries, yet they were essential in terms of managing the pandemic. Then thirdly, we also noted that community-led PPE and detergents production provided some very important relief to many households whom otherwise would have not afforded procuring these essentials on a regular basis. And the pandemic highlighted the importance of savings groups as a critical economic safety nets, given that informal markets were demolished, resulting in cutting off or reduced incomes. The savings ended up being a fallback plan for most households that were part of savings groups, either the federation or cooperatives. So the pandemic highlighted the significance of savings as a fallback plan for communities during times of lockdowns. And what we also noticed around the vaccine uptake survey, during the initial period of the introduction of vaccination program, the demand for vaccines was very high, and yet supply was also low. But I should also point out that at the same time there was also some skepticism when the vaccines were introduced at the very early stages amongst communities, in terms of a lot of conspiracy theories that were being put forth in terms of what is the logic behind the vaccination programs, all that. So there were a lot of theories in communities around vaccination or vaccines in particular, and that had an impact in terms of issues to do with uptake. Next slide. Then, what are the lessons, policy-wise, practice and research, that we drew from the surveys? Firstly, like I indicated, WASH responses should be at the core of resilience-building interventions in times of shocks, such as the pandemic. The demand for water was very huge during the pandemic, and it points to the need for strengthening WASH capacities in communities during pandemics such as the COVID-19 pandemic. And it also speaks to the need for authorities to go through a rethink in terms of how service provision takes place in cities. For example, this may mean for some communities that are not linked to the services grid, there might be need for authorities to kind of think of ways through which those services can be extended, even though we are dealing with settings where the settlements are not planned. Then issues of community savings also proved to be quite instrumental as grassroots mechanisms for cushioning households and communities during lockdowns when most income streams had been shut off. Arbitrary evictions and demolitions without viable alternatives and yet conceived as containment policy measures typically end up increasing densities and disrupting livelihoods. Therefore, there may be need for considering community-led upgrading as an option in place of evictions without alternatives. Then community-led COVID-19 actions such as production of PPEs, production of detergents could be a very critical starting point for building resilient capacities. However, there is also need for the state to come in and help to scale these interventions. Then community-oriented information dissemination platforms and systems could potentially catalyze awareness processes. What are we saying here? We noted and learned through the survey that there has to be that consciousness within authorities in terms of what sort of innovative platforms can we use to spread awareness messages around the pandemic, rather than using the traditional, conventional platforms. Possibly because we are dealing with informal settlements, we also may need to use even the community structures that have been used by groups such as SDI as means and ways of ensuring that awareness messages are disseminated. Then intersection between COVID-19 lockdowns and disconnectivity, I'm borrowing from the word that was used yesterday, I think it was LISA. I think maybe there may be need to think about the experiences during lockdown with respect to issues of connectivity or lack thereof. And possibly that's an area that can be investigated more by academic researchers. Then the issue of vaccine uptake is also an area that may need to continued investigation considering shifting dynamics. I noted earlier that there was huge demand for vaccines when they were introduced, and the supply was way below the demand. And yet, the dynamics have changed as we speak right now. We no longer notice those long queues that were there, and yet we have so many vaccination centers. We are talking of booster jabs, etc. All that. There may be need or some interest around finding out why the kind of dynamics we are noticing now in respect of vaccine, what are the changes that have taken place and what has necessitated those changes. Next slide. So in light of the research, what is the significance for ACRC? Firstly, the pandemic has demonstrated the importance of a multi-sectoral approach that, for instance, considers the different infrastructural systems, both social and material systems, in tackling global pandemic health challenges in cities. For us, we think the pandemic presents or comes, for us it's more of a PCP if you were to look at it that way. And it's the experiences from last year could potentially help in terms of informing conversations around PCPs at city level. And this may be relevant for the health and well-being domain, as well as the healthcare system for those that are working on the set of systems. Then secondly, the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 in informal settlement highlighted unequal cities. This in turn has amplified the need for participatory upgrading of informal settlements, thus contesting how the domain has previously operated. I think when we look at issues of domain from a conceptual framework, there is need for engaging in conversations of where you begin to interrogate how these domains function. And in particular, I'm focusing on informal settlements because we are also working on that as an organization. So the experiences from that research are very key for us to start to think about sort of questions that ought to be asked within the domain of informal settlement. Then lastly, the use of centralized and top-down approaches such as demolitions, evictions, and securitized lockdowns as containment measures for managing COVID by state institutions, both local and central government, reinforces how power plays out in the politics of urban management. Last slide. Thank you.